Yutes Kislev, the 19th day of Kislev, is a historic date on the Hasidic calendar and should be on the calendar of every Jew, because on that day, in 1799, the Alter Rebbe, the first Lubavitcher Rebbe, was vindicated in a trial held by the Tsarist government after the Alter Rebbe had been falsely accused, of course, of many aspects of disloyalty to the Tsar. The Rebbe had, for years, raised great amounts of money to send to Israel, where there was a tiny settlement of Jews who desperately needed support from other countries. Now, Israel at that time was under Turkish rule, and the Czar was at war with Turkey. So the Rebbe's opponents, the Alter Rebbe's opponents, his enemies, slandered the Alter Rebbe and accused him to the Tsar's ministers of supporting Turkey against the Tsar, and more specifically, that the Alter Rebbe had designs of overthrowing the Tsar through Turkey and becoming the king of Turkey or the king of Israel. They also accused the Alter Rebbe of being disloyal to the Tsar because in the Alter Rebbe's teachings in Chassidus, there are 10 attributes, divine attributes, and 10 faculties of the soul, and the 10th, the last attribute, or the last faculty, is called Malchus, royalty. And one of the virtues of Malchus is its humility, which is expressed in Chassidus in the expression, Malchus has nothing of its own. It receives from the previous or higher attributes, but has nothing of its own, like the moon that receives its light from the sun. Well, they made this into a whole anti-Tsarist attitude and philosophy that royalty, the royal seat, or the crown, has nothing of its own, and it is the last and the lowest of the attributes, and so on. The Rebbe was imprisoned, was taken to prison in a black carriage, an armored black carriage or wagon, which was used in arresting traitors. But other than the arrest itself, which of course couldn't have been too dignified, there was a certain dignity, there was a certain respect that with which the Alter Rebbe was treated by all the ministers, including even some of the guards. And in fact, the Tsar himself, after hearing so much about this unusual, brilliant, sagacious, and holy prisoner, disguised himself as one of the court officials and came to interview the Alter Rebbe. When the Tsar walked in, the Alter Rebbe stood up. And the Tsar, incognito, said, "Why are you treating me differently from other ministers?" And the Alter Rebbe said, "Royalty on earth is similar to royalty in heaven. Malchusa da'ara ki ein malchusa d'rakia." When you walked in, the Alter Rebbe said, I felt an awe that I didn't feel with any other minister. And so I realized that you must be the Tsar. At the trial itself, the Rebbe was asked 22 questions on many of the Hasidic customs, on many of the teachings of Hasidus. The Rebbe answered very carefully, very thoughtfully, and without any negativity towards his opponents, towards his accusers and enemies. The Alter Rebbe then later would tell Chassidim that it was extremely painful to have to explain such subtle and sublime ideas to people who had no sensitivity, no refinement, and took what he said and what was written in Chassidus so simplistically and so literally. The Alter Rebbe was arrested. As the previous Rebbe tells us, his arrest was a voluntary one. The Alter Rebbe had the option, he had the choice of refusing to be arrested. And had he refused, the Czar would not have been able to arrest him, because the tzaddik is in control of his destiny. And if the Alter Rebbe had refused, there was no way that he could have been arrested. The Alter Rebbe consulted once he knew that he was going to be arrested, and some official came to actually arrest him. The Alter Rebbe slipped away because he wanted to do this thoughtfully, and he wanted to lay out a plan. And he consulted with one of the famous Hasidim, Reb Shmuel Munkes, as to which way he should go: refuse the Czar or work with the Czar. He eventually chose to work with the Czar because he knew that this was a challenge not to him personally, but to Hasidus, to the teachings of Hasidus, to the future of Hasidus. And so he wanted Hasidus to be taught, and he wanted Hasidus to be available to future generations and to all people in a natural and non-miraculous fashion. In other words, that the earth, that nature itself, should work through its resistance to the godliness of Hasidus and come to accept it on its own and from within the natural system. We see this also in one of the incidents that is related, well-known and an enlightening incident, where the Alter Rebbe, once arrested in the Petropavlovsk fortress, the prison building was separated from the headquarter building, from the office building, where the interrogations were held. It was separated by a moat, by a water. And they had to be ferried across to the interrogation. One night, the Rebbe was being ferried across, and it was the time of the month, at the beginning of the month, when you say Kiddush Levana, the prayers over the rebirth of the full moon. So the Alter Rebbe asked the boatman to stop the boat, because you're not supposed to say prayers, you're not supposed to daven when you're in an insecure place, in motion, where you can't concentrate properly. So halachically, you have to stop the boat in order to be able to say the prayers. At first, the boatman refused to stop the boat, but then miraculously the boat came to a stop. Just stood still in the water. The Rebbe again asked the boatman to agree to stop the boat, to stop rowing, and this time, of course, the boatman agreed. And then the Alter Rebbe said the Kiddush Levana. So the Frierdiker Rebbe explains, why did the Alter Rebbe have to ask again, after the boat had already stopped and was standing still in the water? Why did he again ask the boatman to agree to stop the boat? And his explanation is that the Alter Rebbe wouldn't do a mitzvah under unnatural, supernatural circumstances. In other words, as long as the boat was standing still because of a miracle, then they were existing in a miraculous state. And that was not a kosher or preferred way of doing mitzvahs, because the mitzvah is supposed to affect and permeate and change nature itself. And if the context is not one in nature, then the mitzvah won't have the effect that it's supposed to have on nature. So the Rebbe wanted the boatman to agree to stop the boat so that the context, the situation, would be a halachically correct one naturally, not through supernatural means. In fact, we're also told that the Alter Rebbe asked one chassid to go ahead to Petersburg, and then forbade all other chassidim from coming to Petersburg. And one of the reasons was that among the Alter Rebbe's chassidim, there were such holy men that if they had gotten together, 10 of them in Petersburg, they could have changed the course of events simply through their prayer and through their holiness, which would have made the whole event a supernatural one, a miraculous one, rather than an event working its way, godliness working its way through nature. So we see that the Alter Rebbe agreed to go to prison because the alternative would have been miraculous, and the Alter Rebbe wanted everything to work through nature. In fact, there's a great story that Tzemach Tzedek was... Tzemach Tzedek is quoted as saying that his grandfather, the Alter Rebbe, was given a gift by one of the Chassidim. He was given a gift of a snuff box, a silver snuff box. The Alter Rebbe didn't use snuff, so what he did with the box is he used the lid, the cover of that box, as a mirror to check his reflection in the silver cover to see if his tefillin were in the right place. Because when the Alter Rebbe davened with great enthusiasm and ecstasy, the tefillin would slip to the sides or too low on the forehead. And he was told from heaven that heaven was not pleased with the tefillin being in the wrong place. And so he became very careful to make sure that the tefillin were in the right place, and he would check in the reflection of this silver snuff box. Parenthetically, the Tzemach Tzedek said, don't think that my grandfather, the Alter Rebbe, broke the lid off the box. That was not the Zayda's way. There was a pin that connected the cover to the body of the snuff box, and he removed the pin and separated the cover from the box. It was not the Alter Rebbe's way to break the world in order to improve it. His way was to work with the world and improve it from within without destroying it, without overwhelming it with miracles. Not that the Alter Rebbe didn't do miracles, but that was not a way of serving God. It was not a way of making Chassidus available to the world. And so the Alter Rebbe was taken prisoner, and the trip from Lozhne to Petersburg was a rather lengthy one. And along the way, it became Friday, and the Alter Rebbe insisted that they stop and not travel any further. And this was 6 hours before Shabbos. The wagon driver refused, and suddenly one of the wheels fell off the wagon. When they had fixed the wheel, one of the horses suddenly died. And when they replaced the horse, the horses together could not budge the wagon. It simply wouldn't move. The wagon driver realized that this was a holy man that he was dealing with, and he asked if they could continue on to the next nearest village to spend Shabbos there. And the Alter Rebbe refused. The Alter Rebbe agreed only to pull off the road onto the field, and there they spent Shabbos. The Frierdiker Rebbe writes about this, and he says that if they had waited until it was Shabbos, and a tzaddik is protected from above and is not allowed to be pulled or lured into sin. So if it had become Shabbos, it wouldn't be so special, it wouldn't be such a great wonder that the wagon would stop automatically. because to violate, to desecrate Shabbos, a tzaddik is protected from above, and a miracle would happen from above to keep him from violating Shabbos. But when the Alter Rebbe asked that the wagon stop 6 hours before Shabbos, and then all of these things happened where the wagon just wouldn't go, this is a truly awesome display of the will of a tzaddik and how it controls and affects nature. In prison itself, where the Alter Rebbe was for 52 days, corresponding to 52 chapters of Tanya, in the prison itself, the Alter Rebbe refused to eat anything. And the guards thought that he was going on a hunger strike, or that he was trying to commit suicide because he was guilty and was afraid of going to trial. And so they tried to force feed the Rebbe, but they couldn't. The Rebbe's will, his determination was so strong, they couldn't force him. When the prison official came in, and he was told that they had tried to force feed the Rebbe, he was very upset. And he said, "You don't do this to a man such as the Rebbe." And he came to reason with the Rebbe, and he said, "If you kill yourself, you will lose your portion in the world to come." And the Alter Rebbe said, "In order to keep kosher, I would gladly give up my portion in the world to come." So the official said, "What can I do to help? How can I bring you food that you would eat?" So the Rebbe said, "I don't need any solid foods, but some preserves, some fruit, I would eat if you get it from a Jewish home, and if no one else touches it besides you." And so they were able to bring in some kosher food, and that's how Chassidim found out where the Alter Rebbe was. They had no idea where he had been taken, where he was being held. They found out where the Alter Rebbe was, and the Alter Rebbe was able to slip notes or messages out to the Chassidim at the bottom of the dessert bowl, where he instructed someone to go to Vilna. Now, during the interrogations and during the trial, they asked that the Rebbe translate what he wrote in the Tanya, or in his Hasidic writings. And the Alter Rebbe said that they should be translated by experts, government experts, but it should be done with two translators. And so the texts were sent to Vilna to have them translated into Russian. When this note in the dessert bowl was read, Hasidim didn't know what it was that they're supposed to do in Vilna, but they chose one of the Hasidim and sent him off to Vilna. And they trusted that once they get there, they will, by divine providence, know what to do. And so he came to Vilna, and in the end he met one of the translators. So he begged him to translate the text honestly and precisely, exactly, correctly. The man assured him that he would, and that that's his job, and that he wouldn't dare mistranslate, because there was another translation being made, and they would compare the two translations. In the end, the Chassid insisted that the translator promise him, give him his word, that he would translate it correctly. The man promised, and then said, "I'll be honest with you, the Alter Rebbe's opponents, the opponents to Chassidus, had been here earlier, and they tried to convince me to translate it the way they would translate it, and that they're coming back tomorrow morning, and if you'll come back earlier, I'll hide you in the room, and you'll be able to hear the conversation." So he came back and he heard how the opponents, the enemies of the Alter Rebbe, had brought a falsified translation, which would be very damaging to the Alter Rebbe, and they offered the man 3,000 ruble to use that translation instead of an honest translation. And the Chassid was listening from the other room, and he heard the translator say, "I agree, but I don't want to take any money." And so they left. The translator then showed the Chassid the text that the opponents, that the Rebbe's enemies wanted him to use, and also a proper translation that he had himself already prepared previously. And he didn't want to get into a big fight with these people, so he told them that he would use their text, but in truth and in fact he was going to use an honest text. And so the Chassid felt that he had accomplished what he was sent to Vilna for. This official who helped the Rebbe with the kosher food was a learned man who studied the Bible, and he asked the Alter Rebbe the famous question, why does God say to Adam, Ayeka, where are you? And that's when the Alter Rebbe told him his exact age and said, you are so many and so many years old, and God comes to you and says, where are you? Where are you in your progress, in your growth, in fulfilling the purpose for which you were created? When the trial ended, and people realized that the Alter Rebbe was correct and justified and so on and so forth, and that in fact he was very loyal to the Czar and loyal to the government in which he lived, which is of course consistent with the halacha. The victory, the Alter Rebbe's victory, was celebrated with great festivity. And it was an awesome victory. After all the slander and after all the accusations, it was an awesome victory that the Rebbe experienced. However, the Alter Rebbe, in a letter to Hasidim, after he was liberated, warned the Hasidim that they should not see this as a victory over enemies, but rather as an indication from above that Hasidus will be taught, and Hasidus will be studied, and Hasidus will be available to everyone in the world, and that their opponents, who are really their own brothers and sisters, fellow Jews, should be treated with respect and should be invited to study Hasidus and should not be ridiculed or should not be whistled at and should not be dismissed as losers, because we have to go by the principle of Yaakov, which was the attribute of truth. Had the Alter Rebbe allowed Hasidim to toot their own horn, so to speak, and hold the victory over the enemy, there would have been thousands and thousands of Hasidim, people who became Hasidim. There would have been 50,000 new Hasidim. But the Alter Rebbe didn't want people to become Hasidim for the wrong reasons, or to get involved with the study of Hasidus for the wrong reasons, because of a victory, because of who is up and who is down. And so he the Alter Rebbe insisted that Hasidim remain true to their purpose and not use the victory as an artificial means for proving the correctness or the necessity for the study of Hasidus, but to allow Hasidus to stand on its own. Here's a letter that the Alter Rebbe wrote to the Hasidim right after his release from prison. The Rebbe writes like this: the severity, the harshness of quarrels and baseless hate is well known. Therefore, it is fitting that all those who are moved by the fear of God in their heart, and who stand in awe before the Word of God, should be extremely careful not to be a cause, directly or indirectly, a cause of harm, God forbid. Very careful indeed, because I am tired of bearing this. It is impossible to express in a letter the true concern of my heart, to arouse in the hearts of all our good friends a love also to those of our brothers who are not wholeheartedly with us, along with the love of all Jews, as we are commanded in Torah. Therefore, already a year ago, after the passing of the Venerable Gaon of Vilna, of blessed memory, I issued a strict warning to all our friends not to speak even the least evil or insult about a sage who has passed on, for which there is no excuse in the world whatsoever. However, after these troublesome times which we underwent, there is cause to fear that there might be some laxity, God forbid, that people won't take it seriously, on account of that many people rely on the deceased of the gone of blessed memory. Therefore, again, I issue a warning, double and quadrupled warning, to all of our friends and associates, the close ones as well as those that are far, wherever they may be, that there is no excuse whatsoever to open one's mouth and to loosen one's tongue against the honor of Torah and a venerable and pious Gaon. For we know with certainty that this is wrong, that this wrong, which was brought about, as well as others, did not come from him, God forbid. In other words, the slander and the arrest. The same applies also to their sages and Torah scholars. May the Almighty bless the small along with the great, even though they are not among our followers. No one is to harm them in any way, God forbid, neither by word nor by big or small act. Though sometimes one of them may say something against Hasidus, saying something not to my liking nor to the liking of our followers and good friends, which means they will loosen their tongues against the sublime tzaddikim and saints, the Baal Shem Tov of blessed memory, and his disciples. Even then, he who will hear that should examine himself and bring himself to true tshuva over his own deeds, words, and thoughts, which were not expressed with a godly purpose. For they brought about the wrong, that the misbehavior, that evil is said against the servants of God, whose followers we regard ourselves to be, and in whose footsteps we try to follow. Therefore they suffer on account of us. In other words, the Rebbe is saying that when we see people doing something wrong, or we hear them saying something wrong, we should examine ourselves and see where we ourselves are guilty of the same thing, and then assume that because we did it, that's what made it not only possible, but more likely that others would do the same. And then he says, when remembering this, the heart will melt from what is heard, and will not raise itself to loosen your mouth and tongue against the abusers, for all the people act unwittingly, and may the Almighty forgive them. So this compassion will soften or dissolve the anger and the hatred, and we will have a true Ahavas Yisrael.
Partner with Rabbi Friedman. Visit itsgoodtoknow.org/support.